Um, this is Black Lives Matter, Racism and Resistance from the US to Australia. I'm Caitlin. I'm going to be chairing the meeting today from the Solidarity office in Sydney. So before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that this meeting is being broadcast from Gadigal land, the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, to acknowledge that the struggle for land rights, justice and self-determination continues. And of course, we're going to be hearing much more about that today from our speakers. I guess I'd just like to also say congratulations on what was an incredible series of rallies around the country in Australia yesterday. An incredible show of defiance and solidarity, particularly in the face of the police and various governments trying to rule our rallies illegal. People came out in their tens of thousands anyway, and it was an incredibly inspiring afternoon. So of course, all of this has been inspired by what's been going on in the US, the incredible uprising that we've seen against racism and police brutality, sparked there by the murder of George Floyd, and of course we see parallels in Australia in terms of the brutal racism that's meted out daily against First Nations Australians. And the racism of the Australian state in general, whether it be towards refugees, Muslims, Chinese people, and the rest of it. And we stand in solidarity with all people who face racism and oppression. So today we have an incredible panel of people to speak with us, to speak on this topic. We're very, very lucky to have joining us today from LA. We've got Michael Brown, who is a co-founder of the Long Beach Black Lives Matter chapter. He's been very active in the last couple of weeks, but also for many, many years around racism. We also have Paul Silva, who is the nephew of David Dungay Jr., who was murdered in police custody in 2015. Paul and his family have been fighting for justice ever since. Many of them came down for the rally in Sydney yesterday in a very, very strong display of resistance. We also have Jasmine Ali, who's a member of Solidarity, broadcasting in from Melbourne. She's also a long-time anti-racist activist, was instrumental in founding the Stand Together Against Racism group down in Melbourne, particularly in response to racist attacks on African youth a couple of years ago. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to I'll hand over to Michael Brown, but just to tell people how we're going to kind of run things today. There's a lot of people here, so unfortunately we're not going to be able to hear from everyone, but we are going to take questions throughout the course of the meeting. Each speaker will speak for about sort of 10-12 minutes. But while they're doing that, feel free to send through questions to me over the chat, and I'll put those to the speaker. I'm not sure if I'll be able to put all of them because, as I said, there's a lot of people here. And yeah, also I should say this meeting's being hosted by Solidarity. We're a socialist organisation with branches across the country. We're involved in various campaigns around anti-racist initiatives. The refugee rights campaign. We're involved we're active in our unions and in the union movement, and also in the climate movement, amongst other things. But I'll post more information about that later on, and I'll pass over to Michael.
All right, great. Thanks so much for that intro, Caitlin. First things first, I want to extend a thank you to Solidarity in Australia. Thanks to you, comrades, for not only showing solidarity overseas with working class Black movements here in the United States, but also creating a lane and opening up a space so that radical Black voices can be heard. Because over here, it's not always accessible to us, so we kind of get pushed into a corner and not able to really propagate our ideas. So thanks so much for extending the invite. Just to everybody that's out there watching, thanks so much for tuning in. There's a lot of other things you could have did today, but I really appreciate you tuning in to hear what we have to say, and hopefully we can exchange some good ideas this evening. So just to be quick, I'm going to talk about 4 major sort of headlines that I kind of jotted down, and then I got bullet points under them. So number one, just in case folks have been busy, it looks like you guys have been, holding some big solidarity rallies there for Aboriginal folks in your own land, and also Black people here, namely George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. So solidarity on that. So number one, I'm going to give you guys an update on just the latest of what's happening here in the U.S. And then number two, I'm going to get into some of the nature and sort of the class character and some of the nuances of the particular protests that have been happening this past maybe 8 to 9 days in the country, because they have varied across the country. And then I'm going to get into something that I call interesting developments, just things that have really caught my eye. And then last but not least, I'll maybe spend 1 minute to talk about challenges that the movement face, because that is a real thing, and I never want to give too flowery a sort of outlook. So just first things first, just in terms of just the latest data that we've been seeing, and just the latest like stats, like it's been an incredible, rapidly moving situation here on the ground in the U.S. Like as of today, I just read Left Voice's story earlier. Those are some comrades, based here in the U.S. and also in Brazil. I think we passed well over like 7,000 arrests, just alone across the country with these mass protests and mass actions. According to the latest chart that I saw in terms of the number of cities here in the United States that have had some type of protests, I think it's up to 160 plus. And that ranges from the big population centers like New York and LA, all the way down to the smallest, little enclaves you can think of, little suburban areas, farm towns. There's 10, 12 people out there gathered. Maybe it's only, I saw one where there was one little white girl. She went out in some little town in Kentucky. I wish I could remember the name of it, but yeah, she had like a 1-person protest because she just wanted to stand with Black Lives Matter. She was out there with her little BLM sign. So the widespread nature of this is almost unprecedented. Also, all 50 states in the United States as well have had either some type of march or action or protest or riot over the past 8 to 9 days. So that's also unprecedented. We've had civil unrest in this country before, and also other big issues, but they tend to be kind of parochial in nature. So what's pertinent in New York doesn't always resonate with what's pertinent down in like Gainesville, Florida, something like that. But not this time. This has been different. People have been standing together and protesting and organizing actions in all sorts of cities across the country. Just this past week as well, as many of you may have seen in the international press, the ruling class over here got so afraid of the militancy and the size of these mass mobilizations that pretty much every metropolitan city in this country over this past week has been put into some sort of a curfew. Here in Los Angeles County, where we live at, as of 2 days ago, we were having curfew at 6 p.m. Believe it or not, where we had to be indoors after 6 p.m. And then you couldn't come back out until I think 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. But luckily, through the militancy of the protests, I was telling Caitlin before we got on, they just lifted the curfew here in LA 2 days ago, and in some other cities across the country, because fortunately, people have defied the curfews, and they've been able to amass enough people to where, we basically were daring the police to arrest all of us, which we all know that they can't. So, and also all of our cities at this point, all the big cities are also under some form of National Guard occupation, so to speak. So I know here in my city, Long Beach, we still have the National Guard in downtown, and also in downtown Los Angeles, the National Guard is around, as you guessed it, all the basically the big money areas, the tourist areas. That's the job of the police, of course, and the National Guard is always the guard capital. So, and that's pretty much et cetera for every city across the nation. So, and just to pivot and go into the nature and some of the character of these protests. So many of you have seen a lot of the images and videos that have come really out of the epicenter of this rebellion, which was the city of Minneapolis. To me, it gets no more militant than that. I mean, they overran and burned down a police station. I mean, when I tell you that that's unprecedented here in this country, that's unprecedented, because as fiery and as big as Ferguson, Missouri was a few years ago, and also Los Angeles, where we had a rebellion here in '92, people didn't even think about running over the police station and let alone setting it on fire. So you've had very militant protests like that. And in other cities where, you've had youth, engaging in, pitched street battles with the police and with other elements of President Trump's security detail. When we talk about Washington, D.C., um, un- uh, unfortunately for the rulers of our society, repression has actually bred more resistance. So that's not just a slogan. I think a lot of us as socialists, we use that as a slogan sometimes, and we don't really think about it. But in this case, it's actually rung true. The more that they've beaten people in the streets and brutalized us, and I mean, we come back with even bigger numbers and even more resolution. So this past week, I think things have definitely tailed off as far as, a lot of the looting that we saw and a lot of the private property damage that we saw. So the protests over the last 3 to 4 days seem to be taking it on a different character. But the good thing is that they're ascendant. So all of the protests have actually gotten larger. Particularly today, I just posted something on my Facebook where it showed that just some ordinary high school girls and junior high school girls in Tennessee, they organized a 10,000 person march. 2 weeks ago, this is not even something that I thought was possible, to be honest with you. So you see the arc of struggle and how it's been able to be ratcheted up in such a short amount of time. The movement has been able to create so much ideological space and also prep the ground to the point of where ordinary people who've never even been to a protest are able to enter struggle right now and find a role to play. So whether your role is throwing a brick or breaking a window or holding a quote unquote peaceful protest, there's space for you here. So I think that's been a real good development. Earlier in the week, there was a mass protest in the hometown of George Floyd, who was the man who was killed in Minneapolis. And, they had 60,000 people out there. They said that was double the size of any protest that they've ever had in the city of Houston. So this thing was so visceral and so touching to so many people in the different walks of life that people have just felt compelled to come out. And that story has pretty much been like it had a ripple effect all across the country, in city after city, town after town. And then just as far as like interesting developments that I've seen, like I said, ideological space is very important. Conversations have been opened up that have never been there before in this country, particularly in the last 50 years of McCarthyism and anti-communism. And also we have a very strong ethos of a sort of a quote unquote law and order, which in the American context is basically a racist dog whistle that they employed to attack the radical movements of the 60s, groups like the Black Panthers and such. And that they also use that as a sort of an ideological framework to justify, building up the mass Black incarceration state here in this country, where we have over 1 million Black people, Black men in particular, incarcerated or under some form of state surveillance through probation or parole and, those types of things. So the things that's been happening on the ground is Minneapolis, the epicenter. I mean, you actually have the city council openly talking about defunding the police and getting rid of the cops. Okay, so these are Democrats. I don't know how true these people are to this, but the fact that they're even considering this and they're saying it out loud, that's a huge ideological win for the movement. Entities such as the University of Minnesota and also the Minneapolis School District, they've cut all ties with the Minneapolis Police Department, which is typically a no-no in these big cities because the police unions, which are reactionary and very loud, and they run roughshod over these Democratic administrations in these big cities. They're usually the proverbial like third rail in politics that people do not touch. But there's been so much space opened up and so many people coming to our side that, it's okay now to not only say fuck the police, but also to say, we need to defund the police. And it doesn't sound ridiculous. It's like you get people are like head nodding like, oh, okay, that makes sense. So so that's just been interesting. And another thing is just last week, I mean, those indictments were not handed to us as gifts on a platter. The rebellions, the riots. Yes, I said the riots. Riots work. Struggle outside of the ballot box and narrow electoral politics, direct action. That's the only reason those 4 cops have been indicted. And the original cop, who had his who squeezed the life out of George Floyd. I mean, that's the only reason his his charge was upgraded this past week. People should not be mistaken about it as well. Like I said, that was not a benevolent gift given to us, but instead that came through, real persistent struggle and the fact that people would not leave the streets. So I thought that was an interesting development. Just as far as the Democrats and the Republicans, as comrades know around the world, we don't have a parliamentary system. We have kind of a winner-take-all system. So every 2 to 4 years, we're basically faced with the quote-unquote lesser evilism choice. And 2020 is no different. We have Joe Biden, who's one of the architects of the black mass incarceration state, the carceral state. And then you have a neo-fascist in the White House and Donald Trump, who says things like, if you're looting, we're shooting and that kind of stuff. And he's talking about, bringing in the military and signing the 1807 Insurrection Act, which was last used in 1992 here in Los Angeles, where they signed the Insurrection Act. That was George Bush Sr., and they were able to bring in the American military for the first time in, I think, since the general strikes in San Francisco and Seattle back in the 20s and 30s. That was like the first time they were able to bring in the American military in the cities. So, yeah, he's been threatening that. There's been a lot of bellicose rhetoric coming from Trump's way. He's definitely throwing dog whistles and dog meat out there and red meat to his base. A lot of us think that he's trying to really incite something, on a violent tip. Oh, it's been, and also he's been trying to paint all the protesters as Antifa, which is another dog whistle. So our international friends who don't know, America, when it comes to race, is very nuanced. It's very nuanced. You got to know the language here. There's a lot of euphemisms. And when folks start talking about things like Antifa and quote unquote outside agitators, what they mean is they're saying that outside people are coming in and agitating and stirring up black people. So basically just removing all of our agency and all of our ability to make change, for ourselves and in our own interests. So that's been what we've been getting from the right wing. It's been very bellicose, very loud, and very, just reactionary. And then from the Democratic side, it's been interesting. So in city after city, we've seen them pay a lot of lip service, and say things like Black Lives Matter. I think yesterday in DC, they unveiled, they painted the streets with a Black Lives Matter sign or something like that, or a crosswalk. And, but there's been very little in terms of substance, in terms of what are they offering as far as, actually defunding the police. What would that look like? And shrinking these budgets, and also, cutting off the city contracts with these cop unions, like I said, which pretty much run roughshod over a lot of these administrations. So that's been kind of what we've been getting from the Democrats. I'm sure everybody heard I call him Jim Crow Joe, but Joe Biden, he had a comment this last week where he, his fix for police brutality is, well, we should just train police to shoot people in the leg, which is just absolutely ridiculous. So that just shows you the bankruptcy of lesser evilism politics, and also the bankruptcy of liberalism at this point, the fact that it has absolutely no answers. So just to go over a few other things, I think it's important to note that this is all happening within the backdrop of a historic pandemic. Right now, America is up to a little bit past 110,000 deaths because of the inept inaction of the Trump administration to respond to the COVID-19 crisis. We got 40 million people unemployed since this crisis has started. Much of our healthcare is connected to employment. So you have tens of millions of people who had healthcare as of about a month and a half ago, but ever since we've sheltered in place, they no longer have it. And, they've been transferring with their last two stimulus, quote unquote stimulus acts, they've transferred over $5 trillion, to big corporations and private entities in this country, while giving us all a measly, $1,200 check, which is, something that they haven't even locked in for the duration of the crisis. They have to keep going back in and deciding if they're even going to approve us for more this meager sort of relief that they're calling it. So we haven't gotten any promises of extended, rent moratoriums or mortgage, moratoriums. So this thing could really explode. So I think it's important to factor all of that in when you're thinking of the larger context of this rebellion. George Floyd's death touched it off, but this is about much more. And also, you can't decouple this latest rebellion from what we saw a few years ago in Ferguson, Missouri, and also Baltimore, Maryland, where you saw Black youth largely in the streets, fighting it out with the police, rioting in those cities. And that all happened under our first Black president, and also a Black attorney general in Eric Holder. So we had the Obama administration where you had Black faces in high places. And, at the same time, you had a Black Lives Matter movement taking root under that same administration. So you see how we've been able to, or how we've pretty much exhausted a lot of our avenues in terms of electoral politics and also other outlets and changing the system. So at this point, I think it's pretty predictable that you see more direct action, and you see these growing protests in the streets, and it's going to be interesting to see where they go. So just real quick, I want to wrap up because I really want to get to questions, and I want to hear the other panelists. Just some challenges that the movement faces right now. I think number one is security. Trump's dog whistles to his rabid base, who are heavily armed, though they're small as far as the armed faction of them. That's a real thing. Right-wing terrorism in this country and political reaction is a very real thing in American history, and it's visited us many times. Other challenges are, like I said, the COVID-19 crisis is still happening. We're hoping that those numbers don't spike. The mass nature of these protests have made it really hard to social distance, and everybody, you probably have seen all the protests on the live streams. Everybody's mostly wearing a mask, but close proximity, we'll see what happens with that. So that's a challenge. And also I'd say organized labor here in the United States, very uneven, very uneven. There's great unions like the National Nurses United who've been, wind to the back all the way behind this movement ever since it started. And they've been out there, mobilizing their ranks. But the rest of the organized labor, particularly the democratically aligned misleadership with the AFL-CIO, we've gotten some tepid statements here and there, but there's no call to mobilization. There's no call to strikes. So it's been mostly left to rank and file action, which we've seen in places like New York and Chicago, where bus drivers have, just taken it upon themselves to refuse to drive protesters to jail, for instance, or to transport police officers. Or I read a story the other day where a bunch of riot cops, I think it was in Seattle, they ordered tacos from a place and the workers walked out. So this is not coming from the top. This is just rank and file base struggle, direct actions that people are taking. So we have a few examples here and there, but it needs to be generalized, and we need it to spread a lot more, and we need a real coherent labor movement that can understand that, fighting against police terrorism is a working class issue, and elevating Black lives is paramount to working class struggle in this country, so that we can, build the kind of organization and mobilizations that can ultimately upend this entire system. So I'll stop there, and thanks a lot, Caitlin.
Thanks so much, Michael. That was awesome. I'm seeing lots of people clapping on their screens. That was very comprehensive and fascinating. So I'm going to hand over now to Paul Silva. I think just got to make sure he's on. I think he's on under a different account though. Just give me a moment. Paul, if you're on there somewhere, type me a message. Otherwise, maybe I'll go to Jazz first.
Hi, there.
Yeah. I can hear you but not see you.
Can you hear?
Yeah, I can hear.
And see me?
Yeah, are you using your camera, Paul? There we go. Yep, we've got you.
Yeah, I can see myself.
Cool. I'll give you a quick intro again, because I did it at the start, and I think quite a few people have jumped on since I did that. So thanks so much for joining us, Paul. Just for everyone else's sake, this is Paul Silva. He's the nephew of David Dungay Jr. Paul and his family have been fighting for justice for David for about 5 years now, for his murderers to be brought to justice. So yeah, I'll hand over to you now, Paul. I'll let you know when you get to about 10 minutes.
Yeah, no worries. So my name's Paul Silva, and David Dungay Jr. is my uncle, and he was tragically killed in December of 2015 after he was held down by corrective officer of biscuits. And, you know, he begged for his life in the same way as George Floyd did in the USA, continuously saying that he couldn't breathe. And, you know, despite him begging for his life, corrective officers didn't hold back. And as a result, he died at the hands of them. And, you know, we've had a coronial inquiry in regards to it as well. And it was delayed throughout the coronial inquiry due to lack of time for witnesses and stuff. And, you know, just the inquiry itself was, you know, a bit appalling that we didn't get any justice or any criminal charges out of it, but just the way that lawyers acted for, you know, correctives and the matter they acted in, it showed that they didn't really care about the life of David and stuff like that. And, you know, I believe it was ripped off by the Australian government and the system, as no one was held accountable for their actions, despite all the evidence that was provided, plus the video footage as well. You know, it really does show where racism does take a part. Where based on the colour of your skin here in Australia, law enforcement officers, you know, government people and judges and lawyers sometimes will, you know, control the situation based on the colour of your skin and not just look at you as a human being. Right. It's like here in Australia, racism is out there more than ever. You know, I experience every day with police, whether it's just walking into my local general store. You know, we're continuously watched, and we're continuously pulled over by the police. I was actually attending the Black Lives Matter protest in Sydney yesterday, and I had to travel from Kempsey, New South Wales, which is about a 4-hour drive to Sydney. And just as I got in my car and left the door, a highway patrol officer that previously said to me about 3 weeks ago, he harassed me and said that he'll see me around. So as I was on my way to the march, I was pulled over and got drug tested and breath tested and all of that stuff. So, you know, it's out there and it's happening more than ever. Police are just harassing black folks for no good reason. And, you know, in some cases, as a result, they're losing their lives. Just like George Floyd and David Dungay Jr. Like, my heart does go out over to the USA and solidarity over there. You know, wow. My family does feel their pain, you know, because we've actually watched the footage of our loved one being murdered at the hands of corrective officers. And yeah, our fight's been continuing for the last 5 years, and without anyone being held accountable as yet. You know, we're not giving up, and we're going to keep fighting until someone's held accountable for their actions. You know, also our lawyers did a great job. You know, we're pushing for, we asked WorkSafe to undertake an investigation for involuntary manslaughter, industrial voluntary manslaughter, but they rejected our request to undertake that investigation. Although we do have a criminal barrister looking at the evidence provided by the coronial inquiry to possibly present some criminal charges against all involved, being the nurses and the doctors. But corrective officers back home here in Australia, based on the video that I've watched in regards to my uncle, like a lot of stuff hasn't been made public. So the video that's been seen on social media and out in the media, there's probably 20 plus minutes more of video recording that has not been released to the public. And, you know, the CPR efforts and life-saving efforts that highly paid doctors get paid, that was just appalling. Like, a lifeguard at a pool will probably do better than what they did based on the footage that I've seen. And, you know, corrective officers put David in that position whilst he was secured in his cell and, you know, eating a packet of biscuits. He was no immediate threat to anyone until they opened that door. That door is, you know, thick and made of concrete. There was no way he was going to get out of that cell. He was in no immediate threat to anyone. But it just shows how officers here in Australia abuse their authority and show their use of force against black inmates. You know, we did ask the investigating officers when they came up and visited us at our hometown in Kempsey, and we asked the investigating officers, was there any other inmates that was questioned in regards to what happened? You know, like, because obviously in a jail, the cells are close proximity together and, you know, diagonally across from each other. So other inmates would have had line of sight of what happened to David. And, you know, once they moved him from cell 71 to cell 77, after or in the middle of the movement, or when he's held down on the bed and he takes his last breath, there's also already another inmate in room 71. And they've cleaned up all the blood off the floor of room 71 as well. So, you know, no one's been held accountable for tampering with evidence or anything like that. And also, you know, the coronial inquiry was obviously seemed like it was ripped off, you know, but that's just how the Australian government handles things when it comes to the First Nations people. It's appalling. And I think that, you know, we should take to the streets more and demand justice globally, you know, to get the word out there. And, yeah. I don't think I have much more to say, actually.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Paul. If you're able to stay on, I'm sure there'll be quite a few questions coming through for you. So just after Jasmine speaks next, I'll pass along some of those questions. So
yeah, sweet.
Oh, you just dropped out for a sec. But yeah, we'll keep you on the line then.
Yeah, I'll stay on and yeah.
Cool. Yes, I'll pass over to Jasmine Ali now. There we go.
You can hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay.
Great. Cool. Thanks so much, Michael and Paul. It's really fantastic to hear about the struggle in the US, and obviously as well, Paul, hearing about yesterday in Sydney, people stood up to the cops and the intimidation by the courts to ban that demonstration, and how that demonstration went ahead is incredibly inspiring. I just wanted to acknowledge before I go on to address, you know, the other parts of my talk today, that I'm on Wurundjeri country, and that's where my talk's being broadcast from. And what I want to do today is draw out some of the links between the oppression in the US that Black people have faced and have faced historically, as well as here in Australia for Aboriginal people. And I wanted to kind of, you know, place the policing racist violence that's very systemic in that context, and talk about, yeah, some of the possibilities for the struggle ahead. So as, you know, Michael's already mentioned, you know, what we've seen over the last week or so is, you know, is phenomenal in terms of the demonstrations, the mobilisation, you know, in response to George Floyd's murder at the hands of the police. The scale of the demonstration is huge. I mean, I've read reports about 350 cities. There's been marches, you know, 60,000, 10,000 in various places. And I think what's, you know, so striking about the demonstrations is, you know, the political quality of them. The very staunch anti-racist message around systemic racist police brutality, you know, as Michael said, is something that's been, you know, seen as a fringe issue for a very long time, even though people have been fighting around it, demonstrating around it for a very long time. And now we're seeing, you know, this message really connecting with, you know, hundreds of thousands of people in America and across the world, you know, demanding justice and demanding change. And I think we've already seen, I think George already mentioned this, some of the concessions that have already been won in the US. I mean, you know, the links that have been cut with the schools, with police in Minneapolis. I think the discussion about it now in Chicago, you know, the governor coming out in Virginia talking about getting, you know, getting rid of a racist statue of the Confederate general from the period of around the Civil War. These things, again, like as Michael said, they're the product of the rebellion, they're product of the riots, and they're a product of the anger that's seething in the US. And it's had a global resonance. I've heard of demonstrations yesterday in Berlin, thousands of people on the streets, and obviously here in Australia. I mean, the resonance with the anger it goes very deep, as Paul was talking about. We had 100,000 people, I think, across the different cities, and the links that were being drawn here were it's very explicit, the connection between the racist police violence that is happening in America, and that the same racist police violence that you see here to Aboriginal people, so many deaths in custody at the hands of police, over 430 deaths in custody since the releasing of the report, the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody. And even despite that, and so many high profile cases, things continue to get worse. There's new laws now that openly flout some of the recommendations that came out of that report. Not a single person has been convicted for any of the deaths in custody. And, the very, clear parallels that Paul mentioned about, the way that brutality is being meted out is also very, clear for everybody to see with, David Dunkey's case, and, him uttering, "I can't breathe," the same words that George Floyd, said over, a week ago when he lost his life. And I think, Michael went over this a little bit in terms of, the situation in America and why it's so acute right now. Some of the things, he mentioned was about the way that the coronavirus has, really impacted and had a massive and devastating impact on, Black communities in the US, as well as, this is happening alongside the police killings, at the same time. Like, it's these, these dual processes that are really, showing how Black people in America are bearing the brunt of this very, very brutal crisis. And I think, I wanted to just sort of put that a little bit more in historical context to sort of situate where does the, intense, racist policing, that happens in, in America on, oppressed communities and Black communities, as well as here in Australia on Aboriginal communities. I think it's, it's important for us to understand, this isn't an aberration. It's very much structured into the way that, the economic and the political system is organised. People obviously are aware of the brutal history of slavery, but it was the period of slavery where we first get the development of ideas that say that there is some sort of innate inferiority about Black people and some innate white superiority that come out of this period. I mean, slavery was happening at a time where in Europe you were seeing the consolidation of capitalism as a new economic system was being established, and there were ideas at that time promoted there by the bourgeoisie, talking about people are free, they're free labourers. And so there was a very sharp contradiction at the heart of global capitalism about how to actually explain this massive inequality of having 6 million people enslaved in American and colonies, while also promoting this everybody's equal, everybody's free ideology in the European powers. And so, anti-Blackness became an ideology that was institutionalized across all sectors of American society to justify this, to justify the role of, the plantation owners and the plantation economies. And, it was this same ideology that, drove, was very much a part of driving the colonisation of Australia too. When the British Empire expanded here in 1788, it was a very brutal expansion. They also required anti-Black ideology to justify the dispossession of Aboriginal people from their lands, from their country, to justify the slaughter that went on for the pastoral industry, for the capitalists who were growing rich, off of that, violent and brutal process. And it was also central to the way that the Australian, the newly emerging Australian ruling class was cementing its power in this region as an imperial power, pushing its and projecting its power in the region, across the Pacific Islands, and eventually actually taking formal colonies as well. And the devastation of this process was massive. There's people were talking about, I was reading about, at least in Victoria, from 1835, 30 years later, about 80% of the Aboriginal population was decimated as part of that process. And I'm going over this because I think it's important to situate, modern policing, that we see today, as being very much a part of, of this process as well. I mean, there's a lot of work written about modern policing coming out of the Industrial Revolution in Britain to discipline striking workers and workers organising on picket lines. But in Australia, policing forces, had a dual purpose. They were, I think someone might be unmuted there, but they were very much designed and used, border policing, the mounted police force. They were used to, carry out the massacres of Aboriginal people and cement the power of capitalists at this early period of the Australian colonies. And they were also, the police were also used to discipline workers and the working class and lower classes, to maintain production and to maintain social control and profits for capitalists, across the continent. And so you can see that, these, the role of the police and, in this respect, it continued to play this role across, the different periods of Australian history in this way, and continues to play, an oppressive role, and on the, a heavy weight on the lives of Aboriginal people today. In Australia, I mean, Paul's already described the, daily harassment, the surveillance, and the violence and deaths that, continue to go on, and things are getting much worse. And so I think it's, there's a very contemporary quality as well to the brutal oppression, that was founded historically with the establishment of Australia that continues today. And so when Scott Morrison gets up there and talks about, oh, we're not like America, people are, literally like this guy's living in, a sick joke here, like the whole basis of the country, is founded on this, genocidal, on this genocidal project. And, contemporary policing today continues that. But there's also, I think, a really important element about how racism and oppression for Aboriginal people is institutionalised across a whole range of areas, in employment, the systemic discrimination, in housing, in education, in the labour market, in prisons. I think someone may have mentioned it, but, Aboriginal people are the most incarcerated people in the world. Making up, 2 to 3% of the population, but 30% of the prison population, and there's growing numbers of Aboriginal women too being incarcerated, under the current regime. And there's no justice in the courts. There's no convictions, and you can see even, on other areas like, land rights and heritage. Over the last little while, people may have seen the example of the way that Rio Tinto, basically wanting to expand some of its mines in WA, blew up, a whole lot of really important cultural heritage sites for Aboriginal people, caves and very precious artifacts that, talked about, were from when over 46,000 years ago. So again, this is another example of the way that across a whole lot of the discrimination is systemic, and it's very much embedded into all the parts of the system. And I think I should also mention, I know I've got only a little bit of time left, but the Northern Territory intervention, I think, is another example of seeing the gains that have been won by the Aboriginal rights movement over the last basically since the 1970s. They've started to be wound back. Basic civil liberties being stripped by people, more policing powers, and undermining of community control. So you can see that, systemic nature of the racism and the oppression, how it's very much rooted as, as part of the development of the early part of capitalism and today. And I think that's what's so important, I think, to note as well about the current discontent in the US, because, murder of George Floyd has really become a focus for all of the discontent of, across society. I think, as Michael mentioned, the 40 million people unemployed in the US is huge. It has had a massive impact, and as a result of this, the system not being able to actually provide basic things for people in a pandemic and in a crisis. The identification that people have had with Black Lives Matter really does show how all of the, the different, the exploited and the oppressed issues, are being channeled very much now, in responding to Floyd's murder. And, you can see, different sections of society joining the mobilizations and joining the protests. So I just wanted to finish. I've got a little bit of time just to talk about a little bit about what this means in terms of going forward, because the history of riots, the history of rebellions like this is not an unfamiliar thing in the US. I mean, you can go back to the 1960s, to the 1990s, with Rodney King. The struggles there were very similar, very they were very radical, and again posed another huge crisis for American capitalism. And at that time, though, there was, what we've seen to have happened is that the anger and the discontent and the demands for change have been channeled, into looking for reforms within the system. And I think it's, very clear now, basically because people are demonstrating that these strategies haven't worked. Things are getting worse. The oppression is getting worse. The police violence and the racism is getting much more intensified. And it's happening at a time where there's a massive economic crisis for American capitalism. And we're talking about a situation that's on parallel, if not worse, to the 1930s Great Depression, and massive disillusionment with the system. And, you can see the legitimacy of the leaders at the top of society, like Trump and others, that's also started, to very clearly disintegrate. And people are looking and questioning, for alternatives to how we can actually have a society that's free from racism, that's free from the oppression, that people that has people are mobilizing around with Black Lives Matter today. And I think George touched on this. Michael has touched on this right at the end of his talk about the oppression and worker struggles and labour struggles being very much intertwined in the US. So you've seen the transport workers come out, you've seen health workers starting to come out and raise demands about Black Lives Matter and walking off the job. And I think that, that kernel of resistance, I think really holds the potential to talking about transforming the rebellion into much more generalised forms of struggle, and what we really need to be seeing is black and white workers, of all different, backgrounds coming together, using their industrial power, striking together, breaking the colour line, challenging the racism and the system, because the two things are very intertwined and they can't be decoupled. And I think it's a really important time now to talk about the possibilities for talking about socialism, the socialist society, and a revolution that can bring about this change to such racism that's at the heart of the system. And talking about how we can use that strategy as well today here in Australia to get justice for the families that are dealing with just the brutal onslaught that's happening, and with the incarceration and the deaths in custody with David's family and what Paul has talked about. So I might leave it there and have a bit more of a discussion.
Awesome, thanks so much, Jazz. Just before I start reading out some of the questions that have come through, I'm just going to quickly hand over to Geordie, who's going to just let people know what they can do to get involved in solidarity and in the various campaigns that we're involved in. So I'll just unmute you, Geordie.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, hey everyone. I just wanted to direct you to a Google form that's going to be posted in the chat. Please sign up with your details so there's going to be another deaths in custody mobilization in July. So yeah, put down your details so we can help build for that, because, yesterday was so incredibly amazing. Thank you. I'm sure a lot of you on this Zoom were there yesterday. And it was so bloody powerful to see Paul, you and your family, you know, lead the march of tens of thousands of people who want to fight against racism and fight for justice. So yeah, yesterday needs to be the beginning of a sustained fight, because, you know, the only way we're going to get justice for David Dungai, the only way we're going to get justice for the hundreds of Aboriginal people who died at the hands of our state is if we have, you know, make the ongoing campaigns waged by their families into mass campaigns, you know, the like mass mobilizations we're seeing in the US. And that's the kind of power that can win concessions, that can win justice, and to make sure that no one, you know, no one else dies because of the color of their skin. So yeah, it's this power of Indigenous, Black, White, Pacifica, Arab, Asian, everyone united on the streets, in our workplaces, in our TAFEs, in our universities. That's the only, you know, united power that's going to win justice and also, you know, win a better world. And that's how we uproot racism altogether. And that actually means, you know, Jazz went over it a bit as well, but uprooting racism means overthrowing this system because, you know, as Malcolm X said, you can't have capitalism without racism, and so we need to smash both of them. So I really encourage you to put your details down. We're going to be, you know, plastering all the suburbs with raising awareness about deaths in custody, and putting out all the materials to build for the next mobilization on July 8th, I believe. I don't think we have the materials for that yet, but as soon as that comes out, we're going to be plastering everywhere to get, you know, as many people to the next mobilization. So we can make sure this is a sustained fight, because you're not going to get tens of thousands of people out, you know, month after month unless we build and work hard for that. So yeah, I really encourage people to get involved with that. We're also going to have reading groups, because we need to learn about the struggles of the past. We need to learn from the lessons of past struggles, so we can be on better footing, learn from the predecessors who are also fighting back against racism, against the same system. And just lastly, we also have another Zoom next Thursday at 6:30, talking more about the riots and rebellion in the US. So yeah, please tune into that as well. Thank you again to our speakers. It was so amazing to hear, you know, good thing about Zoom, we can hear from people from the struggle in the US. So yeah, thanks. Please put your deets down and yeah, stay in touch.
Cool. Thanks, Geordie. Yep, have a look at the chat to link to that form. So I got a first question here for Michael. So after Obama was elected as the first Black president, there was talk of a post-racial era in the US, yet racist policing and racialized inequality has not improved. Why is that? Oh, he's not.
There we go. Am I unmuted now?
Yep.
Ooh, that's a good question. That's a good one to tackle right there. Wish I could have thought about it a little bit more, but why was Well, the first thing I'd say is I mean, I think it's important to understand that quote unquote post-racialism, that was part of the marketing to elect Obama. We were never in a post-racial epoch. This is a country that's never really even dealt with slavery in its history of Jim Crow and convict leasing labor and things like that. There's never been any sort of reparations or any, you know, real substantive conversations around that. Just in the past, like 40 to 50 years, I mean, a lot of that stuff has been, you know, due to left-wing scholars and left academics. They've been able to enter a lot of that stuff into the higher education to even allow people to have access to that. So, yeah, this country's never reconciled its settler colonial past, so much akin to Australia, as Jasmine laid out. Both of these countries are settler colonial states. Neither is really reckoned with that or corrected it or got at the roots of it. So yeah, post-racialism, that was just part of Obama's marketing. Obama was seen as, I like to call him the black unblack candidate, meaning, you know, he was black enough to where, you know, he was able to sort of use that as a sort of like a chameleon to fool people. But at the same time, he was safe enough, and he was vetted enough by neoliberal capital and also the military-industrial complex to the point of where, you know, once he got into office, he was going to serve as paymasters. and he was going to do it with a very nice veneer and very soaring rhetoric, and like I said, a lot of flowery language about quote unquote hope and change, and it lulled a lot of people to sleep, unfortunately, all throughout his 8 years. But the reality really didn't comport with his rhetoric. The economy continued to shed jobs and also outsource jobs. And then the jobs that he did bring back under his presidency were pretty much low wage, non-union protected, and very precarious kind of work. A lot of McDonald's, a lot of Walmart jobs. Matter of fact, I think Walmart and Amazon are the biggest private employers in this country. So that happened under Obama. That happened under Clinton. Those are Democrats, and that's the real legacy that they have. So post-racialism. It was always a myth. It was always a myth, and the contradictions that existed under having the first black president, such as rampant police being able to kill black people with impunity, it just underscored that fact that was not only a myth, but that police violence is as much of a class issue in this country as it is a race issue. Neither one is privileged over the other one. They're simultaneous, and they both play into each other equally. So you can't conquer police violence without addressing both race and class. So just the short answer is post-racialism was always just kind of marketing. It was never a real thing, and I'm pretty confident that the record reflects that. Looking back at his presidency these years later.
Thanks, Michael. Unfortunately, Paul has dropped out. He's going to try to find somewhere with some better reception. But if he can't get back on, he sends his apologies. He's currently driving back to Kempsey. But if we don't hear back from him within the course of the meeting, we'll definitely post some more information about how you can what the next steps are for the campaign around David Dungay and how people can get involved. But we'll move on to the next question, which I think is for both the panelists, but maybe I'll throw it to Jazz and Michael can have a bit more time to think about it this time. What role can white people play in the fight against racism? Jazz, do you want to kick that one off?
Yeah,
you're
sorry.
good.
Cool. Just I guess off the top of my head, I guess I think the demonstrations yesterday show the possibilities of having a struggle against racism which involves white people alongside people who are oppressed, and I think that's something that I think a lot of oppressed people probably haven't seen before, like other than, there's, been refugee demonstrations in Australia. Not everyone is necessarily connected to it and may not see that. And all they do see is the racism, in the media, by, the different institutions, in the courts and everywhere else. And so when, you can see the possibilities when people actually do come out and fight together. And I think that obviously is something that's also happening in the US, in a much more sort of magnified way where, workers, I think with some of the nurses and the transport workers are coming out as well. And I think Michael said that, this has been on a bit of a rank and file level, but, there's been a history as well of this kind of possibility in Australia, like the Black Moratorium and, in the 70s where workers walked off the job there for black rights and for land rights. Like this is another example of the possibilities of, workers in the oppressed actually fighting racism together, and workers, using their industrial power and seeing that it's, it is like, it's not something that's just separate to their interests. Actually, racism is an ideology and institution, in our society that doesn't benefit white people. It doesn't benefit, those who, aren't necessarily, oppressed by it, particularly for workers I'm talking about. that it is very much in the interests of the ruling classes. And what happens when, you know, workers accept racism, they actually subordinate their own interests to, you know, the ruling class. And that's, that actually holds back their own struggles, you know, for you know, economic justice, for power, against exploitation. So it is very much, you know, the possibility for, yeah, you know, fighting across the different, yeah, racial lines is there. And I think that's what's probably, you know, very exciting about now, is how these things are coming together in, you know, the context of a very serious economic crisis, where people can see, oh, well, the system doesn't necessarily know how white workers, they're all, you know, they're also unemployed too, and are also struggling, you know, to deal with the system. So yeah, I think that kind of sums it up.
Michael, you want to have a crack?
Sure, definitely. I'll weigh in real quickly. And yeah, Jasmine touched upon a lot of themes that I would talk about as well, because in the American context is pretty unique when it comes to the black-white, not only racial divide, but just all the dialectics that exist between the two. All race relations in this country basically flow from the black and white paradigm. So yeah, if you understand that very interesting history, you can kind of sort of gauge all other race relations in this country. But yeah, just in terms of, you know, what role do white people have to play in the fight against racism, I'd say an integral role. Yeah, in this country, for example, I mean, whites are the majority, so we're a racial minority in this country. I believe we're 13-14%, according to the last census. So of course, you need a plethora of committed anti-racist whites, not colorblindness, not people talking about they don't see race, but, you know, committed anti-racist whites who understand that it's in their own working class and their best interest to, you know, not be complicit in this system, not be complicit with rampant, you know, police terror and violence, because, you know, more black people in this country are killed per capita by the police every year, and also Native Americans. But overall, I mean, more working class white people are actually killed by cops in America. So yeah, you know, that tends to get hidden at times because it's so acute when it comes to black people and Native Americans, especially being the victims of police violence and just the way that we're policed in the cities that we live in. But yeah, that's, if you're just looking at the raw data, more whites are actually killed by the police as well. So they have a material interest in wanting to not only stop police terror, rampant police violence, but also to, you know, pull up the material roots where it stems from and why it exists in the first place, which is the entirety of the system. And also, as Jasmine talked about, it is against, it's just against their interests as well. Because if you look at all the socioeconomically, if you look at all the like worst states in terms of social and economic indicators here in the U.S., they tend to be down in the South. Those tend to be right to work states where, you know, the right to unionize is you know, it's almost a privilege. It's almost a gift if you're able to unionize in those states. And there's a very real and a very raw history to explain, you know, why the big corporations left the industrial centers in the Midwest and also on the West Coast, and they migrated down to the South. And that's because the labor movement in this country, not only did it have to deal with McCarthyism and red baiting, but it also dealt with the fact that it would not directly confront white racism in the South. So if you look at all the social indicators of like the worst states in this country, it's places like Alabama, it's Mississippi, Louisiana, South Carolina. These are all former states in the Confederacy when we had chattel slavery in this country. And, you know, those administrations ultimately, you know, were not able to be broke even by radical Reconstruction. What happened here is that, you know, all of those progressive changes that happened through radical Reconstruction were eventually betrayed and overturned. And ever since, you know, the South has been a hotbed of reaction ever since. So, and a lot of that can be chalked up to the fact that white racism and white supremacy is pretty much run rampant. So I think those are some key reasons and some important history that plays into that question in terms of why whites not only need to be committed anti-racist, but they also need to commit to solidarity. Solidarity over allyship. Allyship is very big here on kind of the left liberal academic campuses, and it tends to stress that white folks need to express solidarity in terms of a lot of performative type of tasks in activism, such as privilege checking. But solidarity is different. That's the recognition that we both have a material interest in waging the same struggles, because we need to pull up and upend the system and build a society so that we can both thrive.
Cool. Thanks, Michael and Jazz. I'm going to combine a couple of questions that are around a similar thing. So this is mostly for Michael. So, Michael, do you feel that Joe Biden is the better option for a presidential candidate now after the last week of mass attention on the topic and his responses? If not, who? And then I'm just going to sort of combine that with someone's that's got a similar question. For Michael, in the US, how do we prevent Biden and the Democrats channeling the focus of the protests into electoralism? After Baltimore and Ferguson, many people grew complacent. So how do we prevent people from seeing liberalism as a solution? So there's a lot there. But...
Okay. Yeah, I love that second one, especially. Just in terms of that first question, I mean, I don't, of course, Biden and Trump are not the same exact thing. I mean, as Cornel West has pointed out, you basically have a neoliberal in Biden, versus a more pronounced kind of neo-fascist in Trump. So to me, it's just a bad choice. It's not a choice. I don't believe that Joe Biden is a better choice, because I believe that a Joe Biden presidency, he's already on record as saying that nothing will fundamentally change under his presidency. So all that's going to do is shift the paradigm even further right, which is the last thing we need in this country. We need discourse, and we need movements in the streets that can move things leftward, and that actually align with popular polls that that show that even in quote unquote red states, things like Medicare for all and a lot of the populist issues that Bernie Sanders ran on, they're actually popular. Unfortunately, Bernie ran in the Democratic Party, which is a dead end for the working class, and we all saw what happened to him. So I don't see Joe Biden as a real alternative. And then for that second question, I'm trying to remember it. How do we prevent the liberals from co-opting all this energy? That's a big question, because they're going to be after this. It's an election year. They're out there. Al Sharpton the other day at the funeral for George Floyd, he already announced a march on Washington, and that's basically going to be a march to get out the vote and vote for the Democrats. I think there's a lot of things happening on the ground that are actually counteracting the co-op attempts. Number one is the black bourgeoisie in this country. I think with Barack Obama, they've lost credibility with the streets. You might have saw the press conference a week ago it was the Georgia mayor or the Atlanta mayor, Keisha Lance Bottoms. She brought out T.I. and Killer Mike to try to convince the young black kids to leave the streets. And, the kids, they stayed in the streets. Not only did they stay in the streets, they destroyed the CNN building. So I was happy to see that. And I think also folks like Obama and the old civil rights establishment, which at this point are only out for their own interests and only interested in patronage rather than they are, working class black upliftment and empowerment. These folks have largely lost a lot of credibility with the streets. So when they start telling people to register to vote, you got to vote for Trump, it's ringing more hollow than it did, 4 and 8 years ago. So, but it is a big challenge. We have a very big nonprofit industrial complex in this country that's just, specializes in absorbing good activists and well-meaning movements and running them into the dead end known as electoral politics. So, yeah, I think the only way to prevent that is out of these big rebellions and mass mobilizations is, those of us on the left, we're going to have to try to help cohere some of this into organization that can point a different way forward instead of voting for the Democrats and the Republicans.
So I guess this is one for Jazz. Thanks, Michael. So it's 30 years now since the Royal Commission into Black Deaths in Custody, yet imprisonment rates for Indigenous people are now dramatically worse and still rising. Why has there been so little progress, and what needs to change?
Okay. Well, I feel like I sort of touched on this a little bit in my talk, just about understanding that it's a systemic problem in terms of, you know, how the racism is being has been institutionalized in law enforcement, in the courts, in a whole number of places. And I think, you know, there is the other issue that we have seen in recent times as well. Various state governments have really pushed a very aggressive law and order agenda themselves, which is, you know, clearly antithetical to the recommendations in the Royal Commission. Like, I mean, Daniel Andrews is one particular person here in Victoria, I mean, head of a Labor government, but, you know, the expansion of prisons that's happened here, the policing that has, been expanded, militarized as well. These are all, you know, these are obviously going in the other direction, that we're not seeing the sort of, demands for, you know, social services and other services like housing, education, getting funding and, you know, being taken seriously. But, you know, these kinds of, I like that term that Michael described, a carceral state, you know, as being much more, consolidated in various places. So I think, you know, a large proportion is, you know, I think that there has to be a renewal of the campaigns and the struggle here as well, to take up the deaths in custody fights that are happening. Obviously, there's, you know, a lot of stuff happening with David Dungay in Sydney, but there's also been a campaign here for Tanya Day, who was a Yorta Yorta woman who was killed in custody a couple of years ago, and that went, you know, to a coronial inquest too. But it's the same sort of thing about, you know, getting, you know, the recognition about how racism actually at every point in the chain led to that result. You know, in her death, it is going to take a very radical and broad struggle to bring about change there. But I do think, you know, there are campaigns that are starting to happen, and I think there's also other fights happening too, where, you know, that we will see around, you know, jobs and wages and other things as the economic crisis deepens, and there's opportunities to build solidarity between these struggles as well. I mean, I was hard to see that there's a bit of a contingent at the Sydney rally for Black Lives Matter. There's a bit of a, I saw some photos of some construction, I think it was a CFMU, MUA, about Black Lives Matter. Like, those things could be far more active and far more mobilised. I think that type of thing, you know, could bring about some further change. But, you know, I think needing that orientation about black and white united fight is going to be key, I think, to building that solidarity and those struggles.
I'm just going to read out one more for Michael, and we're probably going to have to wrap up not too long after that, because it's getting up to it's 3:20 now. So the US has a rich history of anti-racist struggle, from the civil rights movement around Martin Luther King to the Black Panthers and the radical movements of the 1960s. What lessons are there from this for fighting racism today?
Yeah, really great question. I'm not sure who asked that, but yeah, definitely kudos to that person who asked that. So I jotted down kind of 3 quick bullet points. I think number 1, and that's the reason I'm on this call, is international solidarity. The Black radical tradition in America at its height, from the days of slavery and the abolitionist movement, where Frederick Douglass was traveling to England, all the way to the anti-lynching movements that we saw, and the campaigns for the Scottsboro Boys down in the South, who were about to be legally, executed by the state. But, luckily the Communist Party's legal wing was able to wage an international campaign to get them away from the lynchers, all the way to the civil rights movement, which basically used the Cold War strategically and made appeals to the third world movements, and also stood in solidarity with African countries in particular that were winning their independence in the 40s to 50s and the 60s, simultaneously while our people were in the streets en masse. I think internationalism is definitely key. I think we got thrown off a little bit with Obama for 8 years. There were polls that showed that was the first time in like the history of Black people in America where Black folks were actually in favor of like invading Iraq and in favor of these missions overseas. And it's like that was a total break from our tradition. It was we took an ideological step backwards under Obama. So we traded in, the one of the central tenets of the Black freedom struggle, just to basically have a symbol in the White House. So we need to plug back into internationalism. We got friends overseas, and we need to reach out to you folks and get our voices heard, and also to build solidarity across seas, and also reconnect with our Pan-Africanist revolutionary history that we've always had. I think another lesson that we can take from those movements, when you talk about MLK, and I'll throw SNCC in there, and even Marcus Garvey's group, the United UNIA, and also the Black Panthers. Grassroots-based organization. That's one thing that is sorely missing with Black people right now. Our community, in terms of quote-unquote activism, if that's what you want to call it, is really dominated by sort of petty bourgeois, sort of middle-class groups like the NAACP, the National Action Network, also the Rainbow Coalition, and then just like a million nonprofits that are all at the behest of things like the Ford Foundation and other entities like Bill Gates. And what that does is it tends to conservatize your organizing, and it also keeps you attached at the hip with certain sectors of capital. So your struggles and your demands, and also the way that you organize, is always going to be just naturally reined in, even if you're well-intentioned. That's what I meant when I talked about the nonprofit industrial complex earlier. There's like a nexus of organizations that are all caught in that web, and despite the rhetoric of individual activists within them, they're never going to advocate for working class Black people to ultimately overthrow the system. So grassroots-based organization, that's another lesson we need to take away. And then also radical Black unionism. People forget Dr. King died advocating for Black sanitation workers in the city of Memphis. That was his final act. He was talking about the Poor People's Campaign, which was a working class populist movement of multiracial people coming together and advocating based upon the class demands. Conversations that we're having now about universal health care and UBI, that's what he was talking about when he died. So we need to tap back into that radical Black unionism, and also just a basic, we need to establish a basic foundation of class politics. The Black Panthers were mentioned in that question. I mean, they were all about that. They were open Marxists, they were open socialists. Organizations like the Panthers and RAM, and even some of the nationalist organizations, that Malcolm X had around him. They had a basic class analysis of the system. So we need to tap back into that, and I believe those are three things that could really move us forward, and that we should really try to learn from.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Michael and Jazz. We're going to have to wrap up the Q&A there, unfortunately, much as we'd love to hear a lot more, I'm sure, but I'm sure we'll hear more from Michael over coming months, and we can, read his stuff if he's writing. And sorry for everyone whose questions weren't able to be answered. There was a lot that came through. There's a lot of people on here, but I think both people did a really good job of answering them. So yeah, like I said, unfortunately, Paul did drop out of his signal on the way to Kempsey. So he said that Patty Gibson, who's been involved in the case over the last few years, can do a quick wrap up of where the campaign's at and where to next. So I'll hand over to Patty quickly to do that, and thanks again to Michael and Jazz for sharing their insights and ideas. You're both you're very welcome to stay on, Michael, of course, to listen to the rest of all this. But yeah, I'll hand over to Patty now. Where are you, Patty? Yeah. I've unmuted you.
Okay. Thanks, comrades. Yeah, sorry, I've just been messaging with Paul. He's tried to join a couple of times, but the signal's just not strong enough. Sorry. Yeah, so big numbers of the Dungay family came down and actually led the rally here in Sydney yesterday, which was very, very inspiring. Marched up 45 family members from Kempsey, actually marched up to Town Hall and started the rally an hour early because the police said they were going to go in and try and shut down Town Hall and stop us from rallying. So it was a pretty incredibly defiant stand that those guys led. And just before that march started, I was part of a meeting with the family where they were talking about the next steps for their campaign. So people should know they're going to be rallying in Kempsey, their hometown, just on the mid-north coast of New South Wales on the 17th of July, calling for justice for David. So they're going to be inviting people to travel to Kempsey if there's anyone who wants a trip to Kempsey up to show your solidarity. But the huge rally that we're trying to plan, that's my daughter there, that we're trying to plan is probably going to be, we're looking at the 8th of July. So give ourselves a clear month to build for it and march on the Parliament House here in New South Wales under the slogan, I can't breathe. Calling for justice both for David and also expressing solidarity with the ongoing mobilisations for justice for George Floyd in the United States, because the two men did die in such similar circumstances. And the family have got T-shirts and banners done with both images, the images of both men, and really tapping into that to that solidarity. So there'll be a call to action, and I think it's up to all of us. Like, there's been a lot of discussion about what people can do, non-black people, other people can do to support. There's a clear call from the family. They need justice in this case. They want charges laid. It's going to be up to us to build for masses of people to march behind them on the New South Wales Parliament House when they come back to Sydney on the 8th of July. So I think everything we can do to get our workplaces mobilised, to get petitions signed. We're looking to have hundreds of thousands of petitions calling on the Attorney General of New South Wales to actually refer the matter to the Department of Prosecution so charges are laid on the guards. So everyone can work hard to get that petition signed. There's I'll put the link or send to the comrades to put in the link of change.org petition, Justice for David Dungay Jr. We want hundreds of thousands of signatures on that, and a massive march with solid contingents, from trade unions, from community organisations, marching there with the family. So we've got a clear month to build that, and an incredible sentiment out there, I think, to stand up against racism and to show solidarity with what's going on in the United States. So I think it's a real chance for us. This is such a very, very strong family with a very strong stand that led the way to defy the police. I don't know if people saw, but Latona Dungay gave a press conference when the court tried to ban our march, where she said, we do not respect their law because their law is killing us. If we have to break the law to actually take the streets for justice, we will break the law. And this is Aboriginal land, and we've got our own law, which we're going to be following, not respecting their court. So that was a very, very powerful moment. And I think we've got to build on that momentum now and harness that energy. So, if comrades can get involved, we want to put masses on the streets come the 8th of July.
Thanks, Patty. And James has just put that petition into the chat, so you can go through there and add your name to that. We did get a lot, thousands and thousands of signatures yesterday at the rally in Sydney as well. So yeah, there's a huge amount of support out there. I'll just quickly hand over again to Chris Breen, who's going to do a quick plug for the refugee rights rallies coming up this weekend. So, Chris, you good to go?
Okay. Black Lives Matter, Refugee Lives Matter. There's a huge overlap between the two struggles: the racism against Aboriginal people, the racism against refugees. I mean, Jazz mentioned the 432 deaths in custody since 1991. There have been 14 deaths of refugees offshore in detention since 2013, 50 in detention since 2000, and that doesn't start to count the suicides in the community, deaths from deportation, drownings, which are all part of Australian policy. So there's a National Day of Action this Saturday to calling to free the refugees in detention centres around Australia. It's going to be 2 p.m. in the Mantra Hotel, detention hotel in Preston in Melbourne, as well as MITA in Broadmeadows. It'll be 2 p.m. This Saturday at Town Hall in Sydney, and 10 a.m. at Kangaroo Point Detention Centre in Brisbane. It was fantastic to see the rallies, you know, defying the threats from police yesterday, people coming out to say that protest is essential, that protest matters, that protest works, you know, over 50,000 people in Melbourne. Because police have again threatened the rally, the refugee rally in Melbourne. So we want to make sure we get the biggest possible numbers at that. The police are talking about finding the organisers of yesterday's rally. A month ago, I was charged with incitement for organising a car protest. 30 refugee supporters fined $50,000 for, you know, organising a rally in our cars. So getting a big turnout to, you know, try and stop that thing from happening again this Saturday is really important. If as many people could come as possible. I should also mention it was fantastic that Moz from Manus spoke live from inside the detention centre at the Mantra Hotel at the rally yesterday, and that's the kind of solidarity that we need to build between different struggles everywhere. Yeah, 2 o'clock Mantra, 2 o'clock Sydney, 10 a.m. Brisbane.
Awesome, thank you. So thanks for that, Chris. And there's information about those rallies in the chat as well, and we'll also be putting them up on the Solidarity Facebook page. Speaking of which, so as I said, Solidarity is a socialist organisation with branches around the country. Here in Sydney, we in normal times we meet every Thursday night at 6:30 p.m. But at the moment we've been meeting online over Zoom. We have a different topic every week. This week it's going to be from riot to revolution. So come along to discuss what you know, what steps we need to take, what kind of organisations and struggles we need to build, how we can actually get to that. So normally, just to explain, we do also the general format is that we have a talk at the start and then we open it up for discussion, and that will be the case again on Thursday. But also in the meantime, you can check us out at solidarity.net.au. Also check out our magazine that we release monthly, also called Solidarity. Really great coverage of the national and international political situation at the moment, the different union struggles we're involved in, and the rest of it. You can also subscribe to our magazine on our website or through our Facebook. So yeah, get in touch however you want, get involved. Thanks so much again to Michael Brown coming in from the US, sending lots of strength and solidarity to you over there in your monumental struggle. And thanks also to Jasmine Ali for speaking from Melbourne. And thanks everyone for joining.